Zara's hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe of her mother's bedroom, her knuckles white against the polished wood. Aunt Liz had been so certain, so insistent. She had told Zara that if she went there right now, she would see the truth with her own eyes. But standing there, watching her mother's silk robe slip from her shoulders as David, her own David, reached for Brenda with a familiarity that made Zara's stomach lurch. She wished desperately that she had been wrong. The afternoon light streamed through the curtains, illuminating everything she had refused to see for so long. Her mother turned, and instead of shame in those eyes, Zara saw something far more terrifying. A flicker of triumph before the mask of maternal concern slid smoothly into place. Brenda's voice was honey and poison as she told Zara that this wasn't what she thought. But it was exactly what she thought. The question that burned through Zara's mind as her world collapsed wasn't how this happened. It was how many times had she almost known, and how many times had she let them convince her she was crazy. They had started 3 years earlier, on what should have been one of the happiest days of Zara's life. Her wedding day had been modest but beautiful, exactly what she wanted. Intimate, warm, filled with the people who mattered most. She remembered standing in the bridal suite of the small chapel, adjusting her veil in the mirror, when her mother swept in like a storm wrapped in champagne-colored silk. Brenda had looked stunning that day, almost deliberately so, in a dress that hugged every curve, and announced that the mother of the bride refused to be upstaged. Zara had felt a small pang of discomfort when she saw how low-cut the dress was, how the slit ran almost scandalously high, but she'd pushed the thought away. Her mother had always been beautiful, always needed to be seen. It was just how Brenda was, and Zara had learned long ago not to make waves. Brenda had circled Zara like a jeweler appraising a stone, telling her she looked so young and asking if she was sure she was ready for this. Marriage was hard work, she'd said. David was a good man, but he was going to need a strong woman to keep him grounded. There had been something in her mother's tone that Zara couldn't quite place, something that felt less like maternal wisdom and more like a warning, or perhaps a challenge. But Zara had smiled, kissed her mother's cheek, and told her she was ready. She was 25 years old, and she had finally found someone who made her feel safe. David was kind, attentive, and after growing up in a household where her parents' fights had rattled the walls and shaken her sense of security, his gentle steadiness felt like coming home. David had been 30 then, a mid-level project manager at a tech firm with steady income and steadier temperament. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't storm out during arguments, he didn't make Zara feel like she was walking on eggshells the way her father had. When he proposed, he'd been nervous and sweet, fumbling with the ring box at her favorite restaurant, and Zara had cried with relief as much as joy. This was her chance to build the stable, loving family she'd never had growing up. This was her chance to do it right. Her mother had inserted herself into the wedding planning with aggressive enthusiasm, showing up at dress fittings uninvited, overruling Zara's choices for flowers and cake, even suggesting that Zara's dress was a bit plain and offering to pay for something with more personality. Zara had acquiesced on almost everything, as she always did with Brenda. Fighting her mother was like fighting a hurricane. You either bent or you broke, and Zara had learned early that bending hurt less. What Zara hadn't noticed at the time was how much attention her mother paid to David. How Brenda would touch his arm when she laughed, how she'd lean in close during conversations, how she'd ask him to help her with things that didn't really require help. Carrying boxes, moving furniture, fixing a supposedly broken cabinet at her house. David had seemed flattered by the attention, happy to be of use. He'd told Zara more than once that her mom was amazing, so full of life. He could see where Zara got her warmth. Zara had glowed at the compliment, thrilled that the two most important people in her life got along so well. The first year of marriage was good. David was attentive and affectionate, and they settled into a comfortable rhythm in their small 2-bedroom apartment. Zara worked long hours at the accounting firm, often bringing work home, while David climbed the ladder at his company. They talked about children, about buying a house, about the future they were building together. Brenda visited often. Perhaps too often, but Zara told herself it was nice that her mother was so invested in their happiness. Her father had left when Zara was 12, disappearing into a new life with a younger woman, and Brenda had spent years telling Zara that she was all she had left, that they needed to stick together, that family meant everything. Brenda would remind Zara whenever the subject came up that her father had abandoned them. He'd thrown away 18 years of marriage for some secretary half his age. Men were weak, Brenda would say. They needed guidance. They needed to be managed, or they'd stray. Zara had to be vigilant. It was advice that made Zara's skin crawl, but she'd grown up hearing it so often that it had burrowed into her subconscious like a splinter. Things began to shift subtly during the second year of marriage. David lost his job in a round of company-wide layoffs, and it devastated him in ways Zara hadn't expected. He'd always been so confident, so self-assured, but unemployment unraveled him. He spent weeks sending out resumes, going to interviews that led nowhere, watching his savings account dwindle. Zara tried to be supportive, told him they'd be fine, that she made enough to cover their expenses while he looked for something new. But she could see him shrinking, folding in on himself, and it frightened her. Brenda, of course, swooped in like a guardian angel. She'd insisted on helping when she found out about David's job loss. She had plenty of money from the divorce settlement, she'd said. She wanted to cover their rent for a few months while David got back on his feet. It was the least she could do for her baby girl. Zara had been reluctant, but David had been quietly relieved, and she'd convinced herself it was just temporary. Her mother had always been generous with money. It was one of the ways she showed love, or at least what passed for love in Brenda's world. But with the money came more visits. Brenda started showing up at their apartment almost daily, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with homemade meals, sometimes just to check in. She'd sit on their couch for hours, talking to David about his job search, offering advice, telling him he was too good for the companies that had rejected him. She'd tell him he was brilliant with her hand on his knee. They were fools not to see it. He just needed someone who believed in him. And David, vulnerable and hurting, soaked up the attention like a man dying of thirst. Zara tried not to feel jealous. Her mother was helping them after all, and David was in pain. Of course he needed support, but there was something about the way Brenda looked at him, something about the way she'd touch his shoulder or brush imaginary lint from his shirt, that made Zara's stomach twist. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the stress of being the sole breadwinner was making her see things that weren't there. The first time Zara almost discovered the truth was on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after David had lost his job. She'd come home early from work, feeling ill with what she thought was food poisoning. The apartment was supposed to be empty. David had a job interview across town, and her mother had mentioned something about a spa appointment. But when Zara opened the door, she heard laughter coming from the living room. Her mother's laughter, bright and girlish in a way that made Zara's skin prickle. She walked into the living room and found them sitting close together on the couch, Brenda's hand resting on David's thigh, their heads bent together over David's laptop. They sprang apart when they saw her, but not quickly enough. Zara saw the flush on her mother's cheeks, the way David's eyes went wide and guilty. Brenda recovered first, greeting Zara brightly and asking if she was all right. She looked pale. Zara said slowly that she was fine, her eyes moving between them. She asked what her mother was doing there. She'd thought Brenda had a spa appointment. Brenda explained smoothly that she'd canceled it to help David with his resume. He'd asked her to look it over, and she loved to help. They were just finishing up. She stood, gathering her purse, pressing a kiss to Zara's forehead. She told Zara she should lie down, that she looked terrible. David should take care of her girl. And then she was gone, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume and unspoken questions behind her. Zara had turned to David, searching his face. She asked why he hadn't told her their mom was coming over. He said it was last minute, not meeting her eyes. She'd texted while Zara was at work. He didn't think it was a big deal. She was just trying to help. Zara said quietly that she'd had her hand on his leg. The words came out almost apologetically. David's face hardened slightly. He said she was pointing at something on the screen. He asked what Zara was suggesting, his voice carrying an edge. She was her mother, for God's sake. Zara started to say she wasn't suggesting anything, that it just looked strange, but she stopped, hating how she sounded. Paranoid, jealous, crazy. She told him to never mind, that she thought she really was She was going to lie down. She'd gone to their bedroom and cried, though she couldn't have said exactly why. David didn't follow her. When she emerged an hour later, he was watching television as if nothing had happened, and Zara convinced herself that nothing had. She was being ridiculous. Her mother was helping them through a difficult time, that was all. But after that day, Zara started noticing things, small things, strange things. David's phone always face down on the table, her mother texting him constantly. She saw the notifications lighting up his screen, saw how quickly he'd grab the phone and turn away to respond. Brenda buying David gifts, a new watch, expensive cologne, a leather jacket that Zara knew cost more than she made in a month. Brenda would say when Zara questioned the extravagance that he deserved nice things. He'd been through so much, she wanted to spoil him a little. David finally found a new job 9 months after the layoff, but it paid less than his previous position, and he seemed diminished by it somehow, as if the unemployment had carved something essential out of him. He was quieter, more withdrawn with Zara, but he lit up when Brenda was around. They had inside jokes that Zara wasn't part of. They'd exchange glances across the dinner table that felt loaded with meaning. And Brenda's visits didn't decrease. If anything, they intensified. The second time Zara almost uncovered the truth was on their 3rd anniversary. David had been distant all week, preoccupied with something he wouldn't explain, and Zara had planned a special dinner at home to reconnect. She'd taken the afternoon off work to prepare his favorite meal, bought candles and wine, put on the dress he'd always loved. She'd wanted to recapture the intimacy that seemed to have leaked out of their marriage like air from a slow puncture. But when she got home at 3 o'clock, she found David's car still in the parking lot, which was strange because he was supposed to be at work. Her heart hammering with a dread she didn't want to name, Zara had taken the elevator up to their apartment, her mind racing with explanations. Maybe he was sick, maybe he'd gotten fired again, maybe something else entirely. She opened the door as quietly as she could, not sure why she felt the need for stealth. The apartment was silent except for the sound of running water from the bathroom. Zara set down her groceries and walked down the hallway, telling herself she was being insane, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why her husband was home in the middle of the day. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, Zara could see steam, hear the shower running. And then she heard it, her mother's voice, low and intimate, coming from inside the bathroom. Zara's hand flew to her mouth. Her mind went blank with shock. She pushed the door open. Her mother was in the bathroom, fully clothed but leaning against the sink, and David was in the shower with the curtain partially open. Brenda turned, her face a picture of surprise that looked almost rehearsed. She greeted Zara with exaggerated shock, saying she'd scared her. David's face appeared around the shower curtain, his expression guilty and panicked. He asked what Zara was doing home. Zara's voice came out strangled. She asked what they were doing. She wanted to know why her mom was in their bathroom while her husband was in the shower. Brenda laughed, a light tinkling sound that made Zara want to scream. She told Zara it wasn't what she thought. David had called her in a panic. He'd slipped getting out of the shower and thought he'd broken his wrist. She'd come right over to make sure he was okay. He'd been in so much pain, poor thing, and she'd given him some painkillers and told him a hot shower would help. She was just checking to make sure he didn't pass out from the medication. David added quickly that his wrist was fine, holding up his arm as if offering proof. It had just been a scare. Her mom had overreacted, honestly. He'd told her she didn't need to come all the way over. Brenda moved toward Zara and took her hand, saying that of course she'd come. He was her son-in-law. She loved him, and she'd known Zara would be at work, so someone needed to check on him. She asked why Zara looked so upset, then stopped as if with sudden understanding. She asked if Zara possibly thought that she and David were doing something inappropriate. She laughed again, but this time it sounded hurt. How could Zara even imagine such a thing? She was her mother. The words hit Zara like a slap. Shame flooded through her, hot and overwhelming. What was wrong with her? Why did her mind go to such dark, twisted places? Her mother was right. The idea was insane, sick, unthinkable. Zara stammered that she didn't think that it just looked weird, that she wasn't thinking clearly. Brenda said softly, sadly, that Zara had been thinking exactly that. She could see it in her face. Zara had thought something terrible about her, about them. After everything she'd done for them both, Zara would think she was capable of something so vile. Her voice cracked and tears welled in her eyes. Maybe she should leave. Maybe she'd been too involved in their marriage. Maybe they needed space from her. Zara said desperately that she didn't want that she was sorry. She didn't mean it. She didn't think that. She begged her mother not to be upset. David had wrapped a towel around himself and stepped out of the shower. He told Zara that her mom had been nothing but good to them. She'd dropped everything to come check on him. Zara was being unfair. And just like that, Zara was the villain in her own story. She spent the rest of the evening apologizing, reassuring her mother that she loved her, that she trusted her, that she was just stressed from work and hadn't been thinking clearly. Brenda accepted the apologies with wounded grace, and David barely spoke to Zara for the rest of the night. Their anniversary dinner sat forgotten in grocery bags on the kitchen counter. Later, lying in bed beside David's turned back, Zara had stared at the ceiling and wondered if she was losing her mind. Was she seeing conspiracies where none existed? Was the stress of work, of being the primary earner, of her mother's constant presence, warping her perception of reality? She must be. Because the alternative, that her mother and her husband were betraying her in the worst possible way, it was unthinkable. But she couldn't unknow what her gut was screaming at her. She couldn't unsee the way they looked at each other, the way they moved around each other with an ease that felt rehearsed, the way her mother's hand lingered on David's arm, the way David's face softened when Brenda walked into a room in a way it no longer did when Zara appeared. The third near discovery happened 2 months later, and this time Zara had tried to prepare herself, tried to approach it rationally instead of emotionally. She'd been at her desk at work when she remembered that she'd left an important file at home, a client's tax documents that she needed for a meeting that afternoon. She'd driven home during her lunch break, annoyed with herself for the oversight. When she let herself into the apartment, she heard music playing softly from the bedroom, the kind of smooth jazz that she and David used to play on lazy Sunday mornings when they'd stay in bed for hours. Her chest tightened. David should have been at work. And that music. They hadn't played it in months. Zara walked down the hallway, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The bedroom door was closed. She stood outside it for a long moment, her hand on the doorknob, frozen between the need to know and the terror of knowing. Finally, she turned the knob. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. On the bed, she saw her mother and David, both fully clothed but lying together, Brenda's head on David's chest, his arm around her shoulders. They were watching something on a tablet propped up on the pillows, some movie or show that Zara couldn't make out. They both sat up immediately when they saw her, and this time Zara saw real fear flash across both their faces before the masks slammed down. David swung his legs off the bed, asking what Zara was doing home. Zara said numbly that she'd forgotten a file. Her voice sounded far away, like it was coming from someone else's mouth. She asked what they were doing. Why were they both there? Why were they in their bed? Brenda stood smoothly, adjusting her blouse. She explained that she'd been feeling unwell. She'd called David because she was dizzy and didn't want to drive, and he'd been sweet enough to leave work early to come get her. She must have caught that flu that was going around. David had brought her to their apartment because it was closer than her house, and she'd needed to lie down. He was just keeping her company while she rested. They were watching a documentary about gardens. Brenda loved gardens, after all. Zara asked why her mother couldn't have lain down on the couch, and even she could hear how weak her question sounded. Brenda said the bedroom was more comfortable, and it was darker. The living room had too much light when she had a headache. She asked Zara why she looked so suspicious. Did she think they were doing something inappropriate? Her voice rose slightly. Because if Zara did think that, she should just say it. Just accuse them outright instead of dancing around it with questions. Zara said she wasn't accusing anyone of anything, but her voice shook. She just thought it was weird. They were lying in her bed together. Could her mother understand why she might find that strange? David stepped forward, his face hardening. He told Zara that her mother had been sick. She'd needed help. He'd help her. Why was Zara trying to make something sinister out of him being a decent person? He was getting really tired of these accusations. Zara protested that she hadn't accused anyone of anything. David shot back that she didn't have to say it out loud. It was written all over her face. She thought they were having an affair or something, didn't she? She'd been giving him looks for months, checking his phone, asking where he'd been. It was exhausting. She was being paranoid, and it was poisoning their marriage. Tears streamed down Zara's face. She said she wasn't trying to poison anything. She was just confused. Things didn't add up. He was always with her mom. He talked to her more than he talked to Zara. The words came out of David's mouth like he'd been holding them back for years. He said it was because she was easier to talk to, because she didn't question everything he did, didn't make him feel like he was under surveillance all the time, because she was supportive and kind and didn't look at him like he was a criminal. Brenda moved to Zara, putting her arms around her even as Zara stiffened. She told her baby that she was doing it again. She was letting her insecurities destroy something good. David was a loyal man. She'd raised Zara better than to doubt the people who loved her. This jealousy, this suspicion, it was ugly. It was beneath her. And if she kept this up, she was going to drive David away, just like her father had been driven away. The comparison to her father landed like a physical blow. Zara had spent her whole life being told that her mother was the victim, that her father had abandoned them, that men left when women weren't strong enough to keep them. And now here was that same narrative being used against her. She was the problem, her suspicions were the poison, and if David left, it would be her fault. Zara whispered that she was sorry, even though something inside her screamed that she had nothing to apologize for. She would stop. She would trust them both. She was sorry. That night, David stayed at a hotel. He said he needed space, that Zara's jealousy was suffocating him, that he needed to think about whether their marriage could survive if she couldn't learn to trust. Brenda stayed with Zara, stroking her hair while she sobbed, telling her she needed to get her emotions under control, that she was being hysterical, that she was going to ruin everything if she didn't stop seeing monsters in the shadows. And Zara, exhausted and confused and convinced that she was the problem, had promised to do better. She'd promised to stop questioning, stop doubting, stop seeing betrayal in every interaction between her mother and her husband. David came home 2 days later, and they'd gone to marriage counseling at his insistence. The therapist, a kind older woman named Dr. Morrison, had gently suggested that Zara might be dealing with anxiety and trust issues stemming from her father's abandonment. David had nodded along, vindicated, and Zara had agreed to try individual therapy to work on her paranoia. Through it all, Brenda had been supportive and loving, driving Zara to appointments, telling her how proud she was that Zara was getting help. For 6 months, Zara tried to be. She swallowed her questions. She ignored the way David still texted her mother constantly, the way they still spent hours together. She took her anxiety medication and went to therapy, and told herself she was healing, that her suspicions were symptoms of her own brokenness and not reflections of reality. But deep down, in a place she wouldn't let herself examine too closely, Zara knew. She knew the way you know you're dreaming even before you wake up. She knew the way you know winter is coming when you feel the first cold wind. She knew, and she hated herself for knowing, and she pushed the knowledge down into some dark mental cellar where it wouldn't hurt her until Aunt Liz came to visit. Liz was Brenda's younger sister, and Zara had always liked her. Where Brenda was polished and controlling, Liz was warm and straightforward. She lived 2 states away and visited rarely, usually only for major holidays. But one Saturday afternoon, she showed up at Zara's apartment unannounced, her face serious in a way that made Zara's stomach drop. Liz said they needed to talk. Not there. They should go get coffee. They'd driven to a small cafe across town, far from anywhere Brenda might randomly appear. Liz had ordered them both coffee, waited until they were settled in a corner booth, and then she'd taken Zara's hands across the table. She told Zara that she needed to tell her something, and Zara wasn't going to want to hear it. But she couldn't keep quiet anymore because watching what was happening to Zara was killing her. Zara had felt her whole body go cold. She asked what Liz was talking about. Liz said quietly that Brenda had done this before. She'd done it to Liz, and she'd done it to Zara's father, and now she was doing it to Zara. She destroyed the relationships of the people close to her because she couldn't stand not being the center of attention. Zara asked what she meant by saying her mother had done this before. Liz took a deep breath. She explained that when she'd been engaged 20 years ago to a man named Marcus, she'd been head over heels in love with him. They'd been planning their wedding, looking at houses, talking about children. And Brenda had been so supportive, so helpful, just like she'd been with Zara and David. Until Liz started noticing that Marcus was pulling away from her. He'd started finding fault with everything she did. He'd said she was too needy, too emotional, that Brenda had told him Liz might not be ready for marriage. Zara's hands were shaking. She asked what happened. Liz said she'd found out 6 months before the wedding that Brenda had been sleeping with Marcus. She'd been undermining Liz to him for months, playing on his insecurities, making herself indispensable to him. When Liz confronted them, Brenda had cried and told her Marcus had seduced her, that she was a victim, that she'd tried to resist but he was so persistent. Marcus had said the same thing, that Brenda had initiated everything, that she'd manipulated him. Liz didn't know who to believe, but either way her relationship was destroyed. She'd called off the wedding. Brenda had comforted her through the breakup, told her Marcus was never good enough for her anyway. It had taken Liz years to realize that was her plan all along. Zara felt like she was going to be sick alone. She asked why. Why would Brenda do that? Liz said it was because she was sick, because she was deeply insecure and pathologically jealous of anyone she perceived as having something she didn't. When their dad had left their mom, Brenda had decided all men were prizes to be won, that love was a competition, that the only way to prove you're valuable is to take what someone else has. She wasn't capable of letting people be happy if that happiness didn't center around her. Zara protested that Brenda was her mother. She loved her. Liz corrected her gently. She loved controlling Zara. There was a difference. She was telling Zara this because she saw the signs, the constant texting between Brenda and David, the way she was always at their house, the way she'd turned Zara into the villain of her own marriage. This was what Brenda did. She isolated people, gaslit them, made them think they were crazy for seeing what was right in front of their face. Zara said Liz didn't know what she was talking about, but even as she said it, tears were streaming down her face. David would never. Mom would never. Liz told her she was going to say something, and she needed Zara to listen. That afternoon, right then, Brenda had told Liz she had a hair appointment. She'd made a big deal about it, shown Liz the confirmation on her phone. But Liz had called the salon after leaving Brenda's house, and they'd said she'd canceled 3 days ago. David had told Zara he was working late that night, hadn't he? Zara nodded slowly. He had. A big project, he'd said. He'd be at the office until at least 9. Liz said that Brenda had been staying at the Riverside Hotel every Saturday for the past 6 months, room 412. She knew this because she'd hired a private investigator after she'd started suspecting what was happening. If Zara went there right now, she'd find her mother. And Liz thought she'd find David too. Zara whispered that it wasn't true. Liz was wrong. She was lying. Why would she lie about something like this? Liz's eyes filled with tears. She said it was because she loved Zara, because she'd let Brenda destroy her life and she wouldn't let her destroy Zara's. She knew Zara didn't believe her. She knew Zara had been conditioned to trust Brenda over her own instincts, but she was begging Zara to go to that hotel, to see for herself. And when she did, she should please remember that she wasn't crazy. She'd never been crazy, she'd just been gaslit by an expert. Zara had stumbled out of the cafe in a daze. She'd gotten in her car, telling herself she wouldn't do it, wouldn't go to the hotel, wouldn't give in to this insanity. But her hands turned the wheel anyway, and her foot pressed the gas, and before she knew it, she was pulling into the parking lot of the Riverside Hotel. The lobby was elegant and quiet. Zara walked to the elevator like a woman in a dream, pressed the button for the 4th floor, felt her heart hammering so hard she thought she might pass out. The hallway was long and silent. Room 412 was at the end. She stood outside the door for a long time, her hand raised to knock, telling herself she could still turn around, could still preserve the fragile peace she'd built, could still choose ignorance over truth. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The weight of not knowing had become heavier than the fear of knowing. Zara used the excuse that had bought her a key card at the front desk. She'd claimed she was Mrs. Brenda Matthews, that she'd lost her key, and the clerk had been happy to help. The lock clicked open with a soft beep. The room was dim, lit only by the fading afternoon light coming through the windows. On the bed, tangled in expensive hotel sheets, were her mother and her husband. They were naked, wrapped around each other in a way that spoke of profound intimacy, of countless times before this, of a relationship that had nothing to do with emergency phone calls or innocent misunderstandings. David saw her first. His face went white and he sat up so quickly he nearly fell off the bed. He stammered Zara's name, telling her to wait. Brenda turned, and Zara saw it again, that flicker of something that might have been triumph before the performance began. Her mother clutched the sheet to her chest, her eyes going wide with what looked like carefully practiced horror. Brenda breathed Zara's name. She said they could explain. This wasn't what it looked like. They didn't mean for this to happen. They'd tried to fight it. They'd tried so hard. Zara's voice was steady, which surprised her. She told them not to lie anymore, please. She couldn't listen to any more lies. She felt outside of her body, like she was watching this scene unfold from a distance. David scrambled for his clothes, his face a mask of shame and panic. He begged Zara to let him explain it wasn't what she thought. Zara said it was exactly what she thought. It was exactly what she'd been thinking for months, for years probably, and every time she tried to see it, every time she'd almost caught them, they'd both made her feel insane for suspecting. They'd gaslit her. They'd made her think she was the problem. Brenda's voice had shifted now, become harder. She said Zara had been struggling. They were trying to protect her. She hadn't been well. All those suspicions, that paranoia, they'd been worried about her, this thing between David and Brenda. It had just happened. They didn't plan it. But Zara had pushed him away with her jealousy, and Brenda had been there to comfort him. Zara's voice rose. To what? To comfort him? To steal him? Brenda was her mother. Her mother. How could she do this? Brenda told her not to be dramatic. She was acting like Brenda was the villain, but Zara had driven David into her arms. She'd been so busy being paranoid and insecure that she'd forgotten to actually be a wife to him. Brenda had given him what Zara couldn't. Zara said that Brenda had seduced him. She'd manipulated him. She'd done the same thing she'd done to Aunt Liz's fiancé. Brenda's face went still. She asked if Liz had told Zara about that. She called her sister a meddling name. Marcus had come on to her. He'd always been weak, just like Zara's father, just like David. Men were weak. They needed strong women to guide them, and sometimes they mistook that guidance for something else. David was staring at Brenda like he was seeing her for the first time. He asked if she'd done this before, if she'd done this to other people. Brenda snapped at him, asking if he was going to act innocent now. He'd been sleeping with her for 2 years. He shouldn't pretend he'd been seduced. He'd wanted this just as much as she had. Zara repeated the words. 2 years. It had been 2 years. David said quietly, still staring at Brenda like she was a stranger, that it had started after he'd lost his job. She'd been so supportive, and Zara had been so distant. Zara had been working all the time, and he'd felt worthless, and Brenda had made him feel valued. They'd been just talking at first, just friends. But then things had changed. He stopped, shook his head. Brenda had told him that Zara was unhappy, that she'd confided in her mother that she wasn't sure about their marriage anymore. She'd said Zara had asked her if she'd made a mistake marrying him. Zara whispered that she'd never said that. She'd never even thought it. David said he knew that now, and he looked broken, hollowed out. But Brenda had been so convincing, and he'd been so vulnerable. She'd made him believe that Zara didn't love him anymore, that he was losing her, and that Brenda was the only one who understood him. It had started with a kiss, just one kiss, Brenda had said, because she couldn't help herself. She'd said she'd been fighting her feelings for months. And then it had become more, and by the time he'd realized what was happening, he was already so deep in it he didn't know how to get out. Zara said he could have told her the truth any time in the past 2 years. He could have been honest. David said Brenda had told him Zara would never forgive him. She'd said Zara would leave him and he'd be alone again, unemployed and worthless. She'd said as long as they were careful, no one would get hurt, that they could all be happy. Zara would have her stable marriage, he'd have someone who valued him, and Brenda would have. He looked at Brenda with something like disgust. What did she get out of this? Brenda said simply that she'd gotten everything. She'd gotten to matter, she'd gotten to be chosen. She'd gotten to prove that she wasn't some dried-up, discarded ex-wife that no one wanted. She'd gotten to prove that she could take what belonged to her daughter, just like that secretary had taken what belonged to her when she'd stolen Zara's father. The room went silent. Zara felt like she'd been punched in the chest. She asked if this was about her dad, about getting revenge for him leaving. Brenda told her not to be stupid. This was about power, about proving that she still had it. Did Zara think she could move on without her mother, build some perfect little life where Brenda was just the supportive mother on the sidelines? Brenda had created Zara. She'd given her life. Zara didn't get to have something Brenda didn't have. She didn't get to be happier than her mother. Zara said that Brenda was sick. She needed help. This wasn't normal. Normal mothers didn't destroy their daughters' lives because they were jealous. Brenda snarled that she wasn't jealous. She was realistic. She knew how the world worked. Women like Zara, sweet, naive, trusting, they got eaten alive. She'd been teaching Zara a lesson. She'd been showing her that she couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who claimed to love her. Now she knew. Now she was prepared for the real world. Zara's voice was rising, all the anger and hurt and betrayal pouring out of her in a flood. She asked if this was Brenda's idea of teaching, by sleeping with her husband, by gaslighting her for years, by making her think she was losing her mind. Brenda hadn't taught her anything except that her own mother was a monster. Brenda's hand lashed out so fast Zara almost didn't see it coming. The slap echoed in the hotel room, and Zara's cheek burned. David shouted something, but Zara couldn't hear him over the ringing in her ears. Brenda hissed that Zara shouldn't dare call her a monster. She'd sacrificed everything for her. She'd stayed with Zara's father for 12 miserable years because of her. She'd given up her career, her friends, her life, all to be a good mother. And this was how Zara repaid her, with accusations and judgment? Zara touched her cheek, feeling the heat of the slap, and something inside her finally permanently broke. Not her spirit, that strange deep part of her that had always known the truth, but the chains that had kept her bound to her mother's narrative, her mother's needs, her mother's endless demands for loyalty and love. Zara said quietly that Brenda hadn't sacrificed anything. She'd used her. She'd used Zara to justify staying in a marriage she hated, and then she'd used her as an emotional crutch after her father had left, and now she was using her to make herself feel powerful and desired. Zara wasn't her daughter to Brenda. She was just a prop in the story Brenda told herself about how the world had wronged her. She turned to David, who was still half-dressed, looking between them with horror. She told him he was supposed to love her. He'd promised to love her. He'd stood in front of their friends and family and promised to be faithful, to honor her, to forsake all others. And he'd thrown it away because her mother had flattered his ego and Zara had been too busy working to support them to notice he was sleeping with Brenda. David said he was sorry, and he was crying now. He knew he couldn't fix this. He knew he didn't deserve forgiveness. But she should please believe him when he said he'd never wanted to hurt her. He'd been weak, and he'd let Brenda manipulate him, and he hated himself for it. Zara said she didn't care, and she realized she meant it. The words felt like truth, cold and clean. She didn't care about his excuses or his apologies or his guilt. He'd made his choices. Both of them had made their choices, and now she was making hers. She walked to the door, her legs somehow still working, even though she felt like she was falling apart from the inside out. Behind her, she heard Brenda call out, telling her not to be dramatic. She should come back. They needed to talk about this like adults. But Zara kept walking. Down the hallway, into the elevator, through the lobby where the clerk gave her a concerned look that she ignored. She got into her car and sat in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the pain that felt like it was splitting her ribcage open. Her phone rang. Brenda. Then David. Then Brenda again. She turned the phone off. She drove to Aunt Liz's hotel. Her aunt had mentioned where she was staying during their coffee conversation. Liz opened the door in her pajamas, took one look at Zara's face, and pulled her inside without a word. Zara said that Liz had been right, and then she collapsed into her aunt's arms and cried harder than she'd ever cried in her life. She cried for the marriage she'd lost, for the mother she'd never really had, for the years she'd wasted doubting herself instead of trusting her instincts. She cried until there was nothing left inside her but a strange, hollow clarity. Liz held her through it all, stroking her hair, not offering platitudes or false comfort, just being present in the wreckage. When Zara finally quieted, Liz said she was so sorry. She was sorry she hadn't told Zara sooner. She'd been afraid Zara wouldn't believe her, and she'd been afraid of what Brenda would do if she interfered, but she should have spoken up years ago. Zara said it wouldn't have mattered. She wouldn't have believed her. She'd needed to see it for herself. She'd needed to stop letting Brenda convince her she was crazy. Liz asked what she was going to do now. Zara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she was going to leave David. She was going to divorce him, and she was going to cut her mother out of her life completely, and she was going to build something new, something that was just hers, where no one could gaslight her or manipulate her or make her question her own reality ever again. Liz said that took incredible strength. Zara said no. It just took being tired. She was so tired of being made to feel small and crazy and wrong. She was tired of living in Brenda's shadow, playing by her rules, letting her define her worth. She was just done. Over the next few days, Zara moved through her life like she was performing in a play. She went to work, smiled at her coworkers, answered emails, attended meetings. But inside, she was already gone, already planning her escape from the life that had become a cage. David called constantly. He showed up at her office, sent flowers to the apartment, left long voicemails begging for a chance to explain, to make amends, to prove he could change. Zara ignored all of it. She hired a divorce attorney. a sharp woman named Patricia who took one look at Zara's situation and said she was going to make sure Zara got everything she deserved. Brenda was more persistent. She showed up at Zara's apartment, pounding on the door, alternating between tears and fury. She sobbed through the door, asking how Zara could do this to her. She was her mother. Zara was all she had. She couldn't just cut her out of her life because of one mistake. She begged Zara to let her in, to let her explain. She said Zara was being cruel, so cruel. Zara stood on the other side of the door, listening to her mother's performance, and felt nothing but a distant sadness. She'd spent her whole life being manipulated by those tears, those accusations of cruelty, that insistence that Zara owed her loyalty simply by virtue of biology. But she didn't. She'd never owed Brenda her sanity, her marriage, or her peace of mind. After 3 days of showing up uninvited, Brenda changed tactics. She sent Zara's father, the man she'd spent years vilifying, to talk to her. He showed up at Zara's office, looking older than she remembered, his face creased with concern. When Zara agreed to meet him in the coffee shop downstairs, he told her that her mother had called him. She'd told him what happened. She said Zara was having a breakdown, that she was making wild accusations and cutting everyone out of her life. Zara asked calmly if Brenda had told him she'd been sleeping with Zara's husband for 2 years. Her father went pale. He said Brenda had told him Zara thought that, but that it wasn't true. She'd said Zara had been struggling with paranoia and other issues. Zara interrupted gently. She asked if Brenda had told him what she'd done to Aunt Liz, about Marcus. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said quietly that Aunt Liz had told him about that years ago. He hadn't wanted to believe it. Brenda could be difficult, but he'd convinced himself Liz was exaggerating, that the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. Zara said the truth was never in the middle with their mother. The truth was exactly what it looked like. Brenda had seduced her husband. She'd gaslit Zara for years when she'd suspected something was wrong. She'd made her think she was mentally ill rather than admit what she was doing. And now she was trying to use her father to manipulate Zara into taking her back. Her father rubbed his face with both hands. He said he was sorry, so sorry. He should have protected Zara from Brenda. He should have fought for custody when he'd left, but she'd threatened to destroy him in court to make sure he never saw Zara again. And he'd been a coward. He'd chosen the easy path, leaving completely rather than fighting for her. He'd told himself Zara was better off with Brenda, that she'd never hurt her because she was her daughter, but he'd been wrong. Zara agreed that he had been. But she wasn't a child anymore. She could protect herself now, and she was choosing to walk away from both of them, from Brenda and from David. She was choosing herself. Her father reached across the table and took her hand. He told her if she needed anything, money, a place to stay, someone to talk to, he was there. He knew he hadn't been much of a father to her, but he'd like to try again if she'd let him. No pressure, just the offer was there. Zara squeezed his hand, surprised by the tears that suddenly blurred her vision. She thanked him. She might take him up on that. The divorce was ugly. David contested it at first, claimed he wanted to work things out, that they could go to counseling, that he'd never see Brenda again if Zara would just give him another chance. But Zara was unmoved. Patricia, her lawyer, made sure that David understood exactly how bad things would look if this went to trial. The affair with his mother-in-law, the years of gaslighting, the emotional abuse. In the end, David signed the papers. Zara got the apartment, her car, and a clean break. She didn't want his money or his apologies. She just wanted to be free. Brenda tried every manipulation in her arsenal. She sent letters claiming she had cancer, then heart disease, then that she was suicidal, all desperate attempts to force Zara back into contact. Zara verified through Aunt Liz that all of it was lies. When the health crises didn't work, Brenda tried attacking her, posting vague messages on social media about ungrateful daughters who abandon their mothers over misunderstandings, painting herself as the victim of Zara's mental instability. Zara blocked her everywhere, changed her phone number, asked her building security not to let Brenda up. She went to therapy, real therapy, with a trauma specialist who helped her understand that what she'd experienced was emotional abuse and psychological manipulation, that she wasn't crazy and never had been. The therapist told her gently that her mother had narcissistic personality disorder. People with this condition often saw their children as extensions of themselves rather than separate people. When Zara had become independent, when she'd gotten married and started building a life that didn't center around her mother, Brenda had experienced it as a threat. The affair with David had been about reasserting control, about proving to herself and to Zara that she was more important, more desirable, more powerful. Zara asked if people like that could change. The therapist said honestly that they rarely did. Change required acknowledgement of the problem, genuine empathy for the people you'd hurt, and sustained effort to develop healthier patterns. Most people with narcissistic personality disorder couldn't get there because the disorder itself prevented them from seeing their behavior as wrong. It was a hard truth to accept that her mother would likely never change, never acknowledge what she'd done, never be the parent Zara had always hoped she could be. But accepting it brought a strange peace. Zara stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, stopped hoping for closure that her mother was incapable of providing. 6 months after the discovery, Zara's divorce was finalized. She got a promotion at work. Turned out that when she wasn't spending all her emotional energy managing her mother's chaos and her husband's neediness, she was actually very good at her job. She started dating again cautiously and found that she enjoyed being alone more than she'd expected. She took up painting, traveled to places she'd always wanted to visit, had long phone calls with her father as they slowly rebuilt their relationship. Aunt Liz became her closest confidant, the mother figure she'd always needed but never had. Liz was honest and direct, never manipulative, never jealous of Zara's happiness. One evening over dinner, Liz told her she was thriving. She was so proud of her for getting out. Zara said she was proud of herself too, and realized she meant it. She heard through her father that David had tried to continue the relationship with Brenda after Zara had left, but it had fallen apart quickly once there was no forbidden fruit element, no triangulation, no one to hide from. Brenda had apparently discarded him coldly once he was no longer useful to her, and David had been devastated to realize he'd thrown away his marriage for a woman who'd never actually loved him, just loved what he represented. Zara felt no satisfaction in hearing that, just sadness for everyone involved, and gratitude that she'd escaped before wasting any more years on people who saw her as something to control rather than someone to love. A year after the hotel room, Zara sat in her newly redecorated apartment. She'd repainted everything, bought new furniture, erased every trace of the life she'd shared with David. She was making dinner for herself, something simple, listening to music, when her phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. It was David's voice, tentative and small. He asked her not to hang up. He wasn't calling to beg or to make excuses. He just wanted to say he was sorry, really sorry. He'd been in therapy, and he was starting to understand what happened, what Brenda had done to both of them. He knew Zara would probably never forgive him, and he didn't deserve her forgiveness. But he needed her to know that she'd been right about everything. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't paranoid. He'd let Brenda poison her reality because he'd been too weak and selfish to admit what he was doing, and he'd regret that for the rest of his life. Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she said she appreciated him saying that. It helped hearing him acknowledge the truth. But David needed to understand something. What Brenda had done was terrible. But what he'd done? He'd made a choice every single day for 2 years to betray her. He could have told her the truth at any point. He could have stopped. But he hadn't. So while she appreciated the apology, it didn't change anything. She'd moved on. She hoped he could too. David said he understood. He told her to take care of herself. She told him the same. She hung up and went back to cooking, and realized she felt lighter somehow. The apology had given her something she didn't know she needed. Confirmation that she hadn't imagined the nightmare she'd lived through, that the people who'd hurt her knew they'd hurt her. But the real healing hadn't come from David's words. It had come from Zara's decision to trust herself, to honor her own reality, to refuse to be gaslit into submission ever again. She thought about her mother sometimes, wondered if Brenda ever felt regret or remorse. But mostly she didn't think about her at all. That was the real freedom, not needing her mother's acknowledgement, not waiting for closure that would never come, not hoping for a relationship that had always been one-sided. Zara had built a new life from the ashes of the old one, a life where she didn't have to constantly question her own perception, where love didn't come wrapped in manipulation and control, where she could simply be herself without fear of punishment or abandonment. She'd survived the worst betrayal imaginable and come out the other side stronger, clearer, more herself than she'd ever been. The woman who'd stood frozen in that hotel room doorway, shattered by what she'd seen, felt like a stranger now. Someone from another life, someone she'd had to become in order to survive, and someone she'd had to leave behind in order to heal. On particularly hard days when the loneliness felt heavy or when she second-guessed her decision to cut her mother out completely, Zara would remember that moment in the hotel room. Not the nakedness or the betrayal, but the look on her mother's face. That flicker of triumph, that cold satisfaction at having won some game Zara hadn't known they were playing. And she'd remember what Aunt Liz had told her in those first awful days. Her mother hadn't loved her less than she should have. She'd loved herself more than she was capable of loving anyone else. That was never Zara's fault, and it was never her responsibility to fix. Zara had spent 28 years trying to earn her mother's unconditional love, trying to be good enough, quiet enough, accommodating enough to deserve it. It had taken losing everything to realize that some people simply weren't capable of the kind of love that asked nothing in return. Some people saw relationships as transactions, children as possessions, and betrayal as strategy. And Zara had learned, painfully but permanently, that the only person whose love she really needed was her own. Standing in her kitchen now, watching the sunset paint her walls gold, Zara felt something she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Peace. Not the fragile, anxious peace she'd tried to maintain in her marriage, always walking on eggshells, always afraid of triggering another crisis. But real peace. The kind that comes from knowing yourself, trusting yourself, and finally, after so long, being freed.